Thank you very much for these nice words of introduction, and thank you also for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. I just want to say that when I chose the topic for my lecture, this was already many months ago, I had no idea that the war that we are now seeing in Ukraine with all its atrocities, that it would take place. And so I think what I'm going to say speaks really to the topic. It's not just about the brutal military Russian aggression in Ukraine, but in today's world we also see China being more assertive, making strong claims to Taiwan, showing its hegemonic ambitions. All this raises questions about the future of the world order. How do countries interact with each other economically, politically, militarily? And so there are kind of two schools looking at this. On one hand, you have what is called the realist school of international relations. Representatives are Henry Kissinger or John Mearsheimer, and the realist school considers that a balance of power between raw national interests are the main force behind international relations. This is, by the way, is also Putin's view. The idea is that it's only about power, strength, terrorize, and that's, according to that view, that's how the world works. Then there is the liberal internationalist school, represented by many other scholars, and that school claims that the nature of political regimes, whether they are democracies or autocracies, matters for international relations. So what I will do in this talk is to expand on this insight of the liberal school and argue that the geopolitical behavior of states, whether it's about external or internal war, peace, expansion, attitudes towards trade, depends on the nature of the political regime. And I will focus on three relevant types of regimes: empires, nation-states, and democracies. But there are also some combinations of these three types. And so given that we have different political regimes in the world, generalizations assuming similar geopolitical behavior, independent of regime type, can be very fallacious. Empires have played a very important role in history and have existed much longer and in many more territories than democracies. And so the insights from the realist school of international relations are relevant mostly for empires or aspiring empires, but the world has changed so much, especially in the 20th century, and so we cannot necessarily apply those insights. The end of World War I signaled the beginning of the end of traditional empires with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, and the Russian Empire. The British Empire collapsed after World War II with the decolonization movement. The Russian Empire was eventually replaced by the Soviet Empire, which also collapsed, by the way. And so in the aftermath of empires, nation-states formed, some democratic, others not. And as the role of empires declined, the role of nation-states and of democracies has increased. But today's world still features a combination of these three regime types. And so how do empires, nation-states, and democracies coexist? Are there specific common traits to empires that differentiate them from democracies? Do democracies have specific common traits that are different from those of empires? What about nation-states? So these questions are not only academic, they have great policy relevance, as we can see in today's world, and they will play a determinant role for issues of war and peace in the foreseeable future. Ukraine was once part of the Russian and later the Soviet Empire. It is now an independent state, and a large part of the population aspires to become a normal democracy. Another part of the population cares more about Ukraine being a nation state. It shares borders with the Russian Empire, and parts of its territories have been invaded already since 2014. We should not forget that. But the 2022 invasion threatens its very existence as an independent state. What to expect from the coexistence of an empire and a democracy? What about coexistence between democracies and the Chinese empire? So I'll talk a bit about these regimes in turn. First, empires. Some general characteristics of empires. Empires in general are large territories with an autocratic regime, and generally these grew out of territorial states. So in history, if we look at the history of empires, whether it's Persia, China, Egypt, they usually grew out of territorial states. Not always. Sometimes they grew out of city-states, and Rome would be a good example there. Empires have an innate tendency towards territorial expansionism. This is because the rulers in an empire are interested in territorial expansion up to the point where the cost of additional expansion becomes larger than the benefit of larger expansion. Of course, it's not as simple, but it gives an idea of what drives empires. Benefits for empires of expansionism typically include taxes on land revenue, taxes on trade. Land is much less tax elastic than trade, and empires are typically extractive states using tax revenues to fund the army, the police, private goods of the emperor, palaces, tombs, imperial administration. Costs are mostly costs of defense against invaders and internal revolts. Now, empires do not exist only on their own, they coexist and compete. And because they compete, this gives an additional benefit for expansionism. Expansionism is actually what we call in game theory a dominant strategy, because a larger empire has everything else equal, a military advantage over smaller neighboring empires, whether in offense or in defense. Empires have played, of course, a big role in the antiquity and regularly clashed with each other. But the age of colonialism between the 15th and the 20th century was also an age of competing colonial empires. Given the drive towards expansionism, empires do not typically seek to achieve ethnic homogeneity. They tend to be multi-ethnic. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is a good example, but also the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Tsarist Empire, and even China today. Just to give you an idea, the whole western half of China, the western half of its territory, contains only 7% of the total population of China. And this western half is composed mostly of national minorities like Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongols, and China is trying to increase the share of the Han population there. Because of ethnic heterogeneity, empires do not generally have interest in developing nationalist ideology unless one ethnic group is a large majority. And so religions or ideologies have been used instead of nationalism to try to cement empires. Catholicism in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Orthodox religion in the Russian Empire, Islam in the Caliphate and in the Ottoman Empire, Confucianism in China, Zoroastrianism in the Persian Empire until they got invaded by the Islamists. And so rival expansion drive between empires necessarily leads to wars and therefore also to losses. Russia inflicted losses on the Ottoman Empire throughout most of the 19th century. Russia challenged the Austro-Hungarian Empire for domination over the Balkans, and this was a very important factor in the triggering of World War I. As I mentioned, World War I led to the collapse of major empires, again, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German. Japan inflicted losses on Russia and China in the first half of the 20th century, and World War II led to the collapse of the Nazi Empire, the Japanese Empire, but also the British Empire. The Cold War led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the loss of satellite states, as well as Soviet republics like Baltic states, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, these three, by the way, having been part of the Russian Empire. And so empires, when weakened by war, tend to collapse internally, and fragments are replaced by nation states, democratic or not. This is something that we saw after World War I with the emergence of nation states in Central Europe and also partly in Southeastern Europe. We also saw the decolonization in the aftermath of the weakening of the British Empire. Even when in the decline, imperial powers may still show aggressive behavior. The Soviet Empire invaded Central Europe in the aftermath of World War II. The Third Reich replaced the German Empire. China invaded Tibet very soon after the communists took power, and they were still very, very weak at that time. Russia's invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, and now the whole of Ukraine, are examples of aggressive behavior by actually a declining empire. It's very unlikely that new empires would emerge in today's world. There was the attempt of the ISIS caliphate, but this has been preemptively squashed. And so in the past, imperial rivalries would lead to phases of decline and revival, some empires taking over others. But I would argue that in the modern world, empires are doomed. Why? Well, in the past, until actually the Industrial Revolution, land and later also natural resources and slaves were the main rewards of imperial expansion. And that's what has been fought over for centuries and centuries. In the modern world, human capital is the main driver of growth and cannot easily be forced to be productive, because human capital is inside people's heads. It's very difficult to force people to do efficient problem solving. And you know, we're probably seeing it already in Hong Kong right now. But I think this is a major characteristic of the modern era, that human capital is the main driver of growth, together with other factors. In today's world, natural resources can be obtained via trade without the cost of maintaining and defending invaded territory. And the progress of education leads to demands for human and civil rights and for public goods benefiting the general population, albeit with different levels of intensity. And so I would argue that the current Russian and Chinese empires will likely be doomed by backlash from their expansionism, from their repression, possibly leading to initial chaos and quite likely territorial fragmentation. Let me now talk about nation states. Nation states started to develop since the 16th and 17th century based on innovations in military technology that favored centralization and economies of scale in warfare, and thus big armies. Nationalism as an ideology developed mostly in the 19th century, encouraged in part by the development of national literatures in the national vernacular. Nationalism led to demands for the establishment of nation states, especially at that time in territories that were under the domination of empires, and especially among ethnic groups that were marginalized in those empires. And so nation states fed by nationalism tend to aspire to ethnic homogeneity within the boundaries of the nation. This does, in principle, not lead to expansionism and imperial ambitions, though some countries have had characteristics of both a nation state and an empire. which was actually the case of Nazi Germany. Demands for ethnic homogeneity lead less to expansionism, but they lead more to ethnic cleansing within the boundaries of the nation, especially in non-democratic nation states. The development of the Turkish nation state led to the genocide of Armenians, 1.5 million people, but also to the expulsion of Orthodox Christians, later called Greeks, also more than 1.5 million, from Asia Minor, and Greeks had been in Asia Minor since millennia. The Nazis, in their Drang nach Osten, committed genocide on Jews, but also tended to eliminate Slavs altogether to create a Lebensraum for German settlers. Nazi Germany was a monstrous hybrid between a nation-state and an empire, leading to the atrocities of World War II. What we saw in Nazi Germany, we see it similarly in today's China, where the Han population is by far the largest part, and where there really are attempts to kind of get rid or completely marginalize other minorities. We have the example of Xinjiang. I'm not going to go over that, but that's a typical example of what is happening in China. And there are multiple examples of the creation of nation states associated with ethnic cleansing and repressions of minorities to create ethnic homogeneity. Nation state, especially when they are non-democratic regimes, tend to be more inward-looking and close to the outside world. They reject immigration, are mostly hostile to economic takeover by foreign capital, see limited opportunities for international cooperation, and have the realist view of international relations, where the world is seen as a Hobbesian world where the strongest will win against the weakest. Nation states are more likely to experience frictions at the borders because of the imperfect overlap between national boundaries and ethnic boundaries. So they tend to be oppressive towards minorities inside their, and aggressive to neighboring countries who host ethnic co-nationals. I would argue that a typical example of a nation state today would be Hungary under Orban, which is illiberal inside, repressive inside, at the same time defender of ethnic Hungarians in Slovakia and Romania. And this discourse was taking place in Hungary long before Orban took power, by the way. Nation states often do have a good capacity of defense against an imperialist aggressor because of the possibility of nationalist mobilization. In general, demands for ethnic homogeneity are associated to demands for linguistic homogeneity, suppression of dialects, and discrimination of minority languages. And so nation states are nevertheless compatible with some imperfect form of democracy where tyranny of the majority is there. And I would claim that Israel is a good example that tries both to be a democracy and a nation state. And we see the contradictions in how they treat the Palestinians and the Arabs inside Israel. Let me now come to democracies. Democracies were most often born in nation state, but not always. The United Kingdom was still an empire when democracy was introduced within the UK, and the UK is not a nation state and contains different nations and ethnic groups. Italy was composed of city-states throughout its history until it became a unified nation, and because of this tradition of city-states, ethnic groups within Italy were never well defined in contrast to citizenship. And this tradition of citizenship, taken over from Roman civil law, is not based on ethnicity, but on the rights and responsibilities of individual citizens. And citizenship, of course, is a strong basis for a stable democracy, much more than national identity. Even in democracies, a common language helps to reach economies of scale in public goods provision, whereas multiple languages can create these economies of scale due to duplication. Most democracies have one dominant language, but multilingual countries, like I come from Belgium, but Switzerland is certainly also an example, we sometimes see these tensions, but these linguistic tensions can be reduced by having federal or confederal institutions, and that's in a way the beauty of democracy, is that it has the flexibility to accommodate those differences in a peaceful way. One characteristic of democracies is that they feature redistribution from the rich to the poor. And this is directly related to universal suffrage that gives every person the same vote, whether they're poor or rich. And because the poor are in majority, potentially you get redistribution and the development of the welfare state. Nevertheless, this redistributive feature of democracies can lead to secessionist tendencies. Some regions wanting to break away precisely because of those tensions. And I have done research on this. There have been research also done by other people. And so these secessionist tendencies within democracies are not necessarily based on national identity. These are just tendencies. Secession doesn't necessarily always take place because these tendencies will often lead to forms of federalism or confederalism. And so I would argue that democracies are much less expansionist than imperialist regimes or nation states. They are more inward-looking, with a lot of infighting, mostly peaceful. But they are the only regime that would tend rather to secession and to a decrease in the size of countries compared to certainly imperialist countries. I would also argue that democracies have a tendency towards appeasement when other democracies are under attack by imperialist powers. This was the case before World War II, but also with the behavior of countries towards Russia since actually 2014. It's not just now, but it's since 2014. This is not just a mistake that people have not learned the lessons of history. I think it's an intrinsic feature of democracies, as was the slogan in pre-World War II France, "Why die for Danzig?" This is, in general, emperors can send their troops easily, but democracies, you're accountable to the citizens, and why wage a war outside one's own territory? This tendency towards appeasement makes democracies look weak, possibly encouraging further imperialist aggression. So democracies will react late to such aggression, but imperialist powers make the fatal mistake of underestimating the will to defend freedom within national borders. And I think many people are very admirative of the resistance of the Ukrainian people, but this is an example of people fighting for their existence and the very existence of their nation. Democracies, nevertheless, have the best basis for international cooperation with other democracies based on shared values of citizenship and universal human rights. I could expand on that, but I will not because of time. Let me now talk about the special case of US imperialism. This is something, it's a democracy, but we cannot ignore the US history. The modern US started as a number of settler colonies of the UK, Spain, and France. It's not just the UK. Spain and France played a very important role. After the independence from the British colonizer, the US project was definitely imperialist, as territories were conquered over Native Americans, Spanish, Mexicans, and the French. The US also developed democratic governance earlier than other countries, and has faced the secessionist tendencies of democracies. And of course, there's the Civil War in the 19th century. The colonialist tendencies of the US were short-lived and mostly unsuccessful. And so we have seen throughout the 20th century within the US democracies strong isolationist tendencies, which I would argue is normal for a democratic country. But the US has been sucked into an alliance with other democracies in World War I and World War II. And of course, with the Cold War, the US became the leading power in the alliance of democracies against communism. And so the Cold War led to imperialist-like interventions of the US in Asia, Latin America, and Africa in the name of anti-communism. And the US essentially fought to defend capitalism against communism, the centrally planned economy. They fought not for democracy. It was, they supported right-wing dictatorships as long as they were anti-communist. US democracies has many flaws, giving more power to large economic interests compared to other democracies, and also disenfranchising large parts of the population. If you look at the politics inside the US today, that's a major part of what's going on. And so the US alternates between democratic isolationism and demand for intervention by its allies. It is nevertheless currently the biggest international counterbalancing power to the Russian and Chinese empires. Nevertheless, being a large country, there is potential for abuse of power, and we saw this with the Iraq War, and we're likely to see it again. Political polarization inside the US has been quite important, making, in my view, a further move towards decentralization quite likely, and that would mean that the US would become more isolationist over time, not less. So the big question I want to finish with is, what about the challenge of coexistence between imperialism and democracy? It's a big question, and when I started asking that question, I left a blank page for quite a few days. The general answer, I would say, is that such coexistence is difficult, is unstable, will lead to very dangerous clashes that could easily escalate in a world war, killing billions of people. These tensions need to be managed, as empires, even though they are doomed historically, will not disappear overnight. And so let me just make a few words about both Russia and China. Russia first. Since the 19th century, Russian imperialism has been keen to get better access to the Baltic Sea in the north, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean to the south. And this goal was mostly achieved by the Soviet Union. In the north, with the annexation of the Baltic states, domination over Poland, East Germany, neutrality of Finland and Sweden. In the south, with domination over Bulgaria and Romania, but a failure to dominate Yugoslavia and Greece, and with Turkey even joining NATO. So the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union led to a shrinking of the Russian Empire. And today's Russia is demographically and economically weak. The population is shrinking. The GDP is roughly in the size of the Benelux, even though it's the largest territory in the world. But they are still quite strong militarily, and especially in terms of their nuclear arsenal. Putin has been trying to revive the Russian Empire, first by crushing Chechnya. Indeed, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there tended to be tendencies towards fragmentation inside Russia, but Putin has crushed Chechnya. He attacked Georgia and then Ukraine, and tried to revive the Soviet Union by creating a Eurasian Economic Union. The European Union represents an existential threat for Russia because of its attractive power to countries neighboring Russia. The attraction of the European Union played a key role in the 2014 Euromaidan in Ukraine, and even to democratic aspirations within Russia. They exist and they are quite strong, even though they are not represented by the regime. Putin wants to return to 19th century international relations, making his invasion of Ukraine legitimate in the eyes of the world. This will not happen. The outcome of the war with Ukraine will nevertheless be determinant for the future of Russian imperialism and surrounding democracies. So let me now come to China. After abandoning its socialist economy and successfully embracing capitalism, Chinese communist leaders sought strong interaction with the world economy, since economic success is the basis of their legitimacy, for keeping the Communist Party in power. And so, as long as growth was the main objective of the Communist Party, coexistence was relatively easy. But as China is becoming the world's dominant economy, ambitions to be the world's leading power and to redesign the world order are a clear source of international tension. Xi Jinping is reviving China's imperial view of the world, Tianxia, everything under heaven, where China is in the middle and the rest is around China. It's a very China-centric view with a Confucian hierarchy of states. And states are seen as tributary states with a Confucian rank. They're the closest, number 2, number 3, and so this is China's view of the international order. And this is an order that will work only if other countries accept this Chinese view. They try to achieve it via economic pressure. We've seen the bullying of Australia and of little Lithuania, but it cannot work for the US. The US cannot fit this view of tributary states around China, and we have heard some nationalist voices inside China calling for the inevitable destruction of the US. Very scary. Of course, I would argue this is still very premature and there are many other paths possible. The Chinese view of tributary states does not imply military invasion. It only implies peaceful coexistence within a concentric circle of tributary states and the Chinese concept of respect, which means treating China according to the Confucianist moral duty towards a superior power. There's no doubt that there will be future clashes about China's vision of the international order. So to conclude, the coexistence of empires, nation-states, and democracies is problematic and may lead to all sorts of instability. It is important to understand the nature of each country's regime in order to understand its external and internal behavior. Remaining empires should further decline in the future. As I said, the Russian Empire is relatively weak. It will further weaken economically and demographically. The war, especially if it fails, may accelerate the demise of the Russian Empire. The Chinese Empire is in expansion mode, but is facing huge costs of maintaining its empire in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Inner Mongolia, Yunnan, Ningxia, all those provinces where you have very strong national minorities and that are de facto colonies of China. Moreover, the cost of invasion by a communist empire is higher than for traditional empires. Absorbing Hong Kong is proving very costly. Absorbing Taiwan may prove to be a tipping point. China is still militarily inferior and is facing major demographic challenges with a very strong aging of the population. And so to conclude, I would argue that a world of small democracies building supranational institutions to regulate their relations on the basis of commonly accepted rules and threats from empires seems to be the path of the future. While facing empires, democracies need to create for themselves multilateral commitment devices to each other. Let's hope that NATO will work like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those insights. I think every point was extremely riveting, very, very insightful. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for the questions you've already submitted via menti.com. Of course, I forgot to say, you can also raise your hand if you prefer to speak up. We have a couple of ladies here with microphones, and you can use any language you want. Flemish? No? No Flemish.
I speak Flemish, but
okay. Let's start with a question here in the first row.
So at the beginning you were referring to the realist view of politics. So there is, and you mentioned the names, John Mearsheimer and others. And there's a famous YouTube video by John Mearsheimer where he basically accuses the West to be responsible for the invasion of Crimea. And I'd like to have your response on that claim. Because that video, when I looked at it a few weeks ago, it had 14 million clicks. It has now, I think, 23 million clicks already, for the obvious reasons. And I'd like to have your view on this.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask you to be quite brief so we can get through a couple?
Yes, so I think it's a good example where Mearsheimer really adapts the realist school. He says, you know, Russia is powerful, therefore its neighbors have to submit to Russia. And if we don't accept that, that is going to create tension. Let me just say that the narrative on the Russian side, but also on Mearsheimer's side, that NATO is responsible for the aggression in Ukraine is completely wrong. You know, the Western powers actually were always reluctant to admit former communist countries into NATO. But these countries, having been satellites of the Soviet Union, having been colonized by, you know, Russia and the Soviet Union, understood that they need protection because they fear it may come again. And it's coming again. Ukraine asked to be a member of NATO, and maybe if we had said yes, maybe they would not have been attacked by Putin.
Let me get to a question on menti.com. It's the question actually with the most likes. So if you like a particular question, you can click on the thumbs up. In your view, will Switzerland be able to exert more sovereignty outside or within the EU in light of recent global developments such as bloc building and polarization?
I'm not an expert on Switzerland, but I think, you know, this is a question that the Swiss have to, they have to decide for themselves.
All right. There we go.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful talk, Gérard. I'm a little skeptical about your claim that democracies are natural appeasers. I think there's quite a few examples of democracies being quite aggressive. So Britain is a democracy in the 19th century when it acquires most of its empire. The French very happily go to war in 1914 for a variety of reasons. So I'm wondering how specific or how general this claim is that democracies have a tendency towards appeasement. Is this something that's just a modern phenomenon, or you think that there's something deeper that sometimes gets overridden by other factors?
So I've been you know, thinking about it, and so here's a bit my answer. All those countries were actually colonial empires. France, Britain, of course, Britain was the biggest colonial empire. And while there were forms of introduction of democracy inside the country, they still acted mostly as empires. In a way, it's really only after World War II that universal suffrage was introduced. And even then, you know, suffrage for equality of suffrage for women, you know, came much later, and you know, in this country even quite late. So you know, in that sense, I think democracies are very young. So this ideal type of democracy that I explained are still very young. And even, you know, I felt necessary to talk about the US because the US, even though it has had democratic governance for a long time, has behaved like an imperialist power, especially during the Cold War. So you know, so some of these, you know, regimes are kind of hybrid between both. Just like I said, you know, the Nazi regime was kind of a monstrous hybrid of a nation state and an empire, which led to the massive killings.
I think the audience really wants to get your take on what to do when you're a small country. So they've tried again. How can small nation states optimize their position in this bipolar new world order?
I think the best, and that's I mentioned that shortly at the end, is that, you know, especially small democratic countries, they need to unite, and they need to create multilateral commitment devices to defend each other. Because indeed, this general tendency towards appeasement is a problem which can lead to the demise of many democracies. So if the Russian Empire were stronger, and if it would be successful in Ukraine and others, that would be a mortal danger for democracies in Europe. And so that's what I said about NATO. NATO has Article 5 committing countries to defend each other. It has not yet faced that test, but we do need commitment devices, and possibly even credible commitment devices. And one way of doing that is to have troops of different countries be stationed across from each other, because then it kind of creates really an incentive to enter the war in case you're being attacked.
Let me just follow up on that. Basically, you're saying that a military alliance is extremely important. Without one, you're pretty much powerless. But wouldn't that, if everyone does that, follows that logic, wouldn't that antagonize the empire states like Russia even further?
No, I would argue the opposite. I would argue that actually this would be good for peace. It's by showing yourself weakness that you encourage aggression. And that's part of the realist school. Putin understands that argument in that way. If you show weakness, he will attack.
There's a question over here in the middle.
So autocracies are not always the same, they're different. The Chinese autocracy is different from the Russian autocracy. The beauty of the Chinese system has been so far that they could alternate and change leadership at least every 10 years. How do you view now this tendency or the developments that Xi wants to get a further term? Is this, in a way, the end of the Chinese success model, quote unquote, or is there a way out of this in the future?
So it's very interesting that you asked the question, and believe me, when Xi made noises that he wanted third mandate, there has been a lot of noise within the Chinese elite, and people are very upset. They don't talk about it in public, but they're very, very upset about it. While China, kept a communist regime when it introduced capitalism, they introduced rules to try to solve the problem of succession. Succession is one of the biggest problems of all political regimes, and in democracies it's solved by elections. In history it has been solved in different ways, and they solved it in many ways. One, by having a compulsory retirement age. So you cannot be part of the Politburo Standing Committee once you're past 71, I think, is the age. So this is why Wang Qishan, who was the head of the anti-corruption campaign, could not be part of it this time, though he became vice president of the country. The second one was indeed this idea of two mandates. And the third one, people are not sufficiently aware, is that the current leadership chooses not the next leadership, but the leadership after that one. So Deng Xiaoping chose actually he did choose Jiang Zemin, but he also chose the next ones, which were Wei and Hu, and Jiang Zemin already at that time kind of nominated Li and Xi. Li was actually supposed to be general secretary, not Xi. So when Xi came to power, he showed the willingness to make all of this disappear. He is actively searching for a third mandate in October, which is why you see on the international scene he's relatively quiet, and they're actually even though their behavior seems clumsy relative to Western countries, there are actually many countries in Africa, Latin America, that are kind of taking a kind of neutral view of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The other thing is that Xi is now facing the Omicron virus, and I don't know if you heard about the lockdown in Shanghai. Despite the lockdown in Shanghai, there's explosive growth of the Omicron cases, what they call the asymptomatic cases, which of course, is what is happening. And this is creating enormous hardship. And so I think Xi has more sleepless nights than about the Omicron rather than about Russia. But this shows again that autocracies the rules that they may establish are not necessarily very credible and can be wiped away. Also, another rule that was very important was the consensus decision-making inside the Politburo Standing Committee. Xi Jinping is doing away with that.
Gérard, two very brief questions, one on China, one on the US. On China, do you think Ukraine's defiance against Russia has made the Chinese regime think twice about what to do with regards to Taiwan?
Yes. Simple answer, yes.
Number two, do you believe that Mr. Trump will run again in 2024? And if he does, he will probably lose. I think that's your prediction.
I would think he will lose, but again,
what happens then?
We can't be sure.
What happens?
Sure, because you see, he's continuing to pretend that he won the election, and people want to go past that. Moreover, the noise he's made about Putin has been very unpleasant in the ranks of the hardline democratic hawks. So, but you never know. I frankly, the fact that he was elected in the first place was such a shock to so many people. So you don't know. I think not, and I hope not.
Mm-hmm. I recently read a quote from you on that very question. I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, if he runs again and loses, which is likely, he will repeat the lie that he won and may mobilize his troops to be more violent actions than on January 6th. Is that a misquote, or is that correct?
No, if he runs again, whatever the outcome of the election, he will claim he has won. And then it may be much more violent than on January 6th. It's scary. One reason why the imperialist regimes of Russia and China are being so aggressive is that they feel that the West is in decline, and nothing more than basically Trump being in power has convinced them that this is the case.
Gérard Roland, thank you so much for your insights and taking all the questions. Thank you.